All right, so I try to break this down, the American Revolution, which really takes place over quite a long time. Something I think is often lost on students growing up in the United States. A lot of times the American Revolution is portrayed as something that happened within a year or two, but no, it was a long process of events, twists and turns on this kind of road to just getting to the eventual war. You start getting major complaints from the British colonists in the 13 colonies, 13 North American British colonies, as early as 1763. And we'll talk about how that gets going, particularly in that year. And you get kind of crises in the colonists' relations to Britain itself, the so-called mother country, the imperial country. And these crises and conflicts they're not really fighting each other on the battlefield yet. This goes on for a long time, 13 or 12 years before the war breaks out. The first fighting happens in 75. 12 years is a long time to have a whole bunch of complaints. Complaints go back and forth between Britain and the colonists. So we'll talk about how they're arguing back and forth for a while. That's kind of the first section here, the phases. And by 75, you get the outbreak of actual fighting on small-scale battlefields, and that will start the actual war. Quickly after that, the colonists will declare independence. They'll say that these colonies want to become an independent country. And they have to justify that. And that's what they write down in a document that they call the Declaration of Independence to give their argument to the rest of the world. This is why we're doing this. So they're giving their theory of revolution, why it's necessary for them to rebel and become independent. Quickly, we'll go through the fighting itself on the battlefield, and the U.S. will get its official independence in 1783, and we'll talk about the kind of aftermath of that economically. So this is a long-term evolution. If you look at the dates up at the top, 1763 to 97, we're talking about 25, 35 years. This is a long time. So this is some people's lifetimes. Alrighty. All right. The American Revolution has its beginnings in a different war that is mostly a European-centered war. The Europeans call it the 7 Years' War, or they'll eventually call it the 7 Years' War because it lasts for 7 years. This is mostly a war of several European countries fighting each other over dominance of Europe itself. It goes worldwide because two of the countries fighting each other are Britain and France, and they are the two big colonial powers by the 1700s. Spanish Empire is falling apart. Britain and France have colonies all over the globe. And the other two major areas of warfare spread to India, where they will fight an apocalyptic war against each other for who's going to dominate India for the long term. And also in North America, basically between those 13 colonies versus the French that are up in what is today Canada and along the Mississippi River down to New Orleans. So what starts off as a European war that drags Britain and France into it, they start fighting each other throughout their colonies. And by 1763, Britain has won the colonial war. They've kicked the French out of India completely, and India will remain a British colony until the end of World War II, so that's about 200 years. And Britain will take control over virtually all the useful lands in North America, kick the French further and further west. Questions about that at all? No? All right. So these are the areas that Britain will now claim as a result of, in 1763, as a result of winning this war. They started off in this kind of darkish, kind of orangish, brownish type area along the coastline, but France will give to them, be forced to give to them at the end of the war, at the peace treaty, all of Canada and all of these western lands between the original 13 colonies and the Mississippi River. So this is a huge amount of land that is changing hands, going from France to Britain. And the French are told to basically be in New Orleans and west of the Mississippi River. So the British land holdings in North America, triple at least. That's a huge amount of territory. All right. The major problem facing the British at the end of the war is that they've gone into massive debt to fight the war. They've borrowed a lot of money. And the Parliament in London, basically the British version of Congress, decides that they need to increase taxation to get more government revenue every year to pay down the debt. The debt is astronomical at that point. So they will start passing new laws to raise not only their own taxes, they mostly raise their own taxes on themselves in Britain, but they'll also raise taxes on the North American colonists. And this is the beginning of the colonist complaint. There were other economic-centered laws that were already in place. The biggest one was called the Navigation Act, which said that any boats leaving the American colonies, if they're not going to Britain itself, say if you own a boat based in Boston and you want to take goods made from Boston and bring them into Portugal, the British government doesn't like that very much. So they force American ships to stop off in another British colony first before going all the way to Portugal. Why would they do that?
To get the goods, the better goods they have?
Not just the goods, but the value of the goods. Because when you pull into a new port, you have to go to basically the port authority and declare what your cargo is and how much of it you have. And the port authority basically taxes you on it. So if you took your boat directly from, say, Boston to Portugal, you would pull into a Portuguese port and pay the tax there. And Britain didn't like that because that's money leaving Britain. Does that make sense? So they say, stop off at another British place first, pay your tax there, and then you can go to Portugal. Navigation Act had been around a long time, virtually the entire 1700s, so that's pretty old news. A lot of American colonists, or British colonists in North America, try to avoid that tax as much as they possibly can, so there's a lot of smuggling going on, which is really pretty common when you have a fairly high tax level. But the British Parliament in 1763 starts passing these laws saying that they're going to increase taxes on the colonies. And that same year, the British government announces that they're going to send 10,000 troops to the North American colonies. So the colonists get like this dual message. Your taxes are going up, and we're sending a huge amount of soldiers to your area, even though the war is over. So how do the colonists look at that? Well, they don't like it, but what do they think this really is? They think what? Yeah, they think it's a tyranny. They think, well, they're upping our taxes and they're sending all these troops in here to enforce the tax. So anyone who complains will be thrown in jail or, something bad will happen to them. So immediately when the war ends, a lot of colonists are looking at these new laws suspiciously, to say the least. They also passed another law the next year, this 64 Currency Act, which forbids the American colonies from printing their own money. Back then, the colony of Massachusetts printed basically Massachusetts dollars. Colony of Virginia printed Virginia dollars. So they had all these different kind of currencies floating around. And the British government said, this is crazy. We have to get rid of all these kinds of money to just have all colonies basically use British-made money. And they had a decent argument because it was a pretty confusing money system. You got 13 different kinds of money floating around, at least. But the colonists look at this and say, well, then where are we going to get our money from? And Britain demands that they get money from Britain. And that money doesn't come for free. So if the kind of paper money is being printed, say, in London, the American colonies are forced to buy that money. And how do you buy money? What do you use?
Gold.
Gold or silver. And right after this law passes, you see a lot of gold and silver leaving the colonies and going to Britain. So a lot of colonists, especially kind of businessmen type colonists who understand economics and are paying close attention, they see this as a conspiracy to suck gold and silver out of the colonies and bring it to Britain and give them paper in return. Does that make sense? So a lot of the business leaders throughout the colonies are very angry about this kind of stuff. They see it as harming their interests, their private businesses, their family-owned businesses. Because if you start sucking wealth out of a place, you're not going to have as many people with money, so you can't sell as much stuff, right? Is that clear? Okay, so questions about any of these at all? Nope. All right. The problem, though, for the business leaders is they know that they're upset and they're communicating amongst themselves. But they also know that just the business leaders in the colonies, they're not enough of the whole population to convince the British Parliament to alter their view. Just the businessmen in the colonies are not enough people to raise a big enough complaint to stop the British government from doing all this. Does that make sense? So they have to figure out a way to convince the rest of the colonists, the average workers out there, to also complain. Right? And this is a problem in politics even today. I mean, how to very wealthy candidates convince you, the average people, to go vote for them. Sometimes it's kind of funny, the attempts they make. No? I think it's funny. Maybe you disagree. But at that point, the British government also hands the business leaders in the colonies the perfect law to outrage the average people. And this is called the Sugar Act. And this is why it's a giant kind of big law that's always discussed, often discussed in mistaken ways, though. The Sugar Act actually reduces the tax on sugar. And the people are outraged. Which on the surface of it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Until you realize a kind of in the details type part of the law. The Sugar Act changes the trial system. Basically, a lot of colonial smugglers have been getting away with avoiding taxes for many years. And the way they do this is really pretty simple. They just don't pull their boat into the harbor at 2 in the afternoon. They don't go to Boston in the middle of the day because that's where all the tax collectors are. So if you want to get in secretly, where do you go? Anywhere else. Anywhere there's not tax collectors. So Boston seemed to be the center of this problem for the government. There's a lot of boats coming into the Massachusetts colony. They're not going to Boston Harbor. They're going 8 or 10 miles up the coast and they're landing at 1 in the morning. Why do you do that? To unload your stuff in secret. Because if you can unload it in secret, you avoid the tax, and you're so close to Boston, you just kind of put it on wagons or something and sneak it into the city and sell it, and you make your money, you don't pay the tax. Does it make sense? They're smugglers. And the British government, the royal government of Massachusetts, run by a guy appointed by the king personally, for years have been just pulling its hair out trying to figure out how can we possibly stop this. So they start paying off informants. Every once in a while the government catches some of these smugglers in the act of unloading their boat in the middle of the night trying to avoid the tax, so they catch them with all the evidence. And they arrest them, file charges against them, and there's a trial. And the trial happens in Boston usually. And who ends up on the jury? Average people of Boston, right? It's a trial by jury. Jury of your peers, which is common law of England. But who else lives in Boston? Boston's a mercantile town. It's mostly other business owners, people who own boats and are often doing the same thing themselves, just haven't been caught yet. So if you're a smuggler, and everyone else on the jury is a smuggler virtually, what happens when another smuggler goes to trial and you sit on that jury? You can hear weeks of evidence against this person, and what does the jury do at the end?
Innocent.
Find them not guilty, because they're all friends. Right? Does that make sense? So this was driving the British government nuts for years and years. They have clear evidence that these people are guilty, but they can't get any convictions. So these smugglers are getting away with it like crazy. And the Sugar Act is an attempt to stop that. The Sugar Act changes the law so that if you're accused of smuggling, you do not go to trial by jury. You go to a trial in what was called the Vice Admiralty Court, which is basically a military tribunal run by the British Navy, where now you don't have a jury deciding whether you're guilty or innocent. You have an admiral in the British Navy as your judge and your jury. Yeah. This is like being court-martialed. So guess what happens to the conviction rates? They go way up because the king's appointee is now the judge and the jury. Of course he's going to find virtually everyone guilty. And this pisses off all smugglers, because now they're actually going to be punished for their crimes. And they don't like that. So, the businessmen understand this is going on and that they're really threatened now. And they take the Sugar Act and they bring it to the average colonist out there. People who don't own their own businesses. They're just average workers. And the business leaders say, this is Parliament and the King taking away one of your natural born rights, your right to trial by jury. And they did it by passing a law where you had no voice in that vote. They passed this law in London. They didn't ask Massachusetts colonial government what they thought. They didn't care. So that's another right that these leaders say that the government is trampling on the rights of the people, the inherited rights of Englishmen. Does that make sense? And they say that this is where the famous phrase, no taxation without representation, means that I'm living in Boston, I didn't get a vote for who my representative in Parliament is sitting in London. Therefore, they have no right to tax me. Does that make sense? None of the colonies had any representation in Parliament in London. They have their own colonial legislatures in Virginia and New York and wherever in the 13 colonies. But they didn't get to vote in this stuff. This is all passed in the home country. Does it make sense? So it basically says you cannot tax us without our representatives taking part in those debates. from this point forward, the most radical leaders of what eventually becomes the revolution accuses the British government of trampling on the rights of the people. And the basic message is, if you allow the government to get away with these, then they're going to keep coming after more and more of your rights until you are a slave to the government. Say a people with no rights are slaves, which is an interesting analogy to make, because some of these people really do own like real slaves, right? So there's plantations, there's racism, there's all that going on, and a lot of people making these big statements about human freedom are themselves slave owners. And there's many famous instances of that, right? And that was pointed out by many critics even at the time. So that's why the Sugar Act is such an important transition. This is where the businessmen get an opportunity to say, this isn't just going to hurt us, this is going to hurt everybody in the colonies. And there's a lot of colonists who agree, and their complaint grows and grows and grows, and finally Parliament's going to have to take a stance on what to do about this. It's getting so large, sometimes violent, that Parliament can't just ignore it. Does that make sense? So, good with these? Yeah.
What kind of claims were they making besides the taxes? But mostly that's what the problem was, right?
It's the tax and the removal of the jury system for these types of crimes. And of course, the statement is, if you allow them to take away your trial by jury for smuggling, then eventually it's going to be like petty theft and burglary, and they're just going to keep applying more and more crimes to the admiralty system. Other questions? No? Good? Alrighty. Moving on. But Parliament keeps these laws. And they keep passing more laws, trying to get more revenue. The next big famous one is called the Stamp Act, which is basically a government approval of fairly private documents. Anything that you would, any kind of official government recognized document that you would need to do something in your even personal life, like get married, you need a government sanctioned marriage license. It will have to have this stamp. And in order to get the stamp, you have to pay. So documents incorporating a business need the stamp. Newspaper publishers need the stamp. And the British government views this as a fairly easy way to force the colonists to pay. So it's another tax. And again, the colonists start complaining, well, we didn't have any voice in this debate. We have no representatives in London, so how dare you tax us? And at virtually the same moment, they pass another law called the Coercive Act, which is going to send even more soldiers to the colonies, because Parliament's starting to realize that they've got a problem with all this. And through these two laws particularly, now that the colonists are complaining, well, you don't have the right to tax us without us having representatives in London, Parliament explicitly says that it has the right to pass legislation, laws, including tax laws, for any of its colonies without their voice being heard. The British Parliament basically says, we are the imperial center, we are the home country, we are the ones who make decisions, and you have to follow orders. And they say pretty clearly, we are like the parent, and all the colonies are our children, and it's the child's duty to obey. So Parliament says, we're kind of willing to listen to your complaints, but just like when you listen to your kids' complaints, you might listen for a little while, but your decision is made, and whatever they say is not going to really have much impact. That doesn't go over too well within the colonies. Or A lot of people in the colonies agree with the British Parliament that this is justifiable, but a lot of the colonists don't. Does that make sense? All right, moving on to the next one. Okay. The Stamp Act really angers a lot of people. There's a lot of paranoia about how far these stamps are going to reach. It even gets to the point where some colonists claim that even if you want to play a card game, each individual card is going to have the stamp. So it starts the fear starts getting pretty extreme. But at this point, a lot of the colonists say now's the time to really put our foot down and basically refuse to buy these stamps and say this is all basically illegal. And there's a strong feeling in most of the 13 colonies to support this kind of move. So each colony, each colonial legislature picks out some of its own guys, like 4 or 5 of its own guys, and sends them to New York City to meet. And they call this a Stamp Act Congress, where the representatives of different colonies are going to get together in a committee, basically, and figure out what are we going to do about this? What can we do about this? Their eventual decision is to write a letter to the king and a letter to Parliament saying that these 13 colonies, in a united voice, are complaining about their loss of 2 essential freedoms, as they called it, which is trial by jury and their right to tax themselves through their own approval. And say these 2 rights have been stolen from us and we want them back. Or else. And whenever you make that kind of statement, you better have a pretty good threat. And their threat was economic. There's a lot of anger amongst many colonists. There are mobs moving through cities, especially Boston, violently attacking some tax collectors and other representatives of the government. So it's a very scary time in a lot of ways, in some places. But their major threat is really economic. They threaten to boycott British goods. And what does a boycott mean?
Nobody buys their goods.
Yeah, it's a refusal to buy stuff. So if I was going to boycott, say, McDonald's, I'd try to start a boycott and convince everyone else to refuse to buy anything from McDonald's until McDonald's does A, B, and C, whatever my demands are. Does it make sense? And this is what the colonists do at this point. They issue this letter directly to their governing bodies in London saying, give us back our rights, or everyone in our colonies will refuse to buy British-made goods. We will not buy imports. We will make our own stuff. And that's a very scary threat because the colonial economies have been booming. This is a major source of wealth for British investors and government revenue. So if these colonists just stop buying, that could really bankrupt the British government and a lot of British companies. Does that make sense? So Parliament's response is to repeal the Stamp Act before the end of the year. They set a deadline, basically. So the stamp tax is gone. But at the same moment, they issue this other law called the Declaratory Act, which is, declaratory mean declaration. It's a statement that says that even though we're getting rid of this tax, we still have the right to pass any laws for the colonies that we feel like, whenever we feel like. We don't have to listen to the colonists' complaints. We don't have to have any colonists in Parliament casting a vote on these laws.
So it's basically like they're going to have unfair representation?
Yeah. They say, we are the home country, we are the parents, you are the children. And yes, we admit that this stamp tax wasn't a very good idea, so we're getting rid of that one, but we still have the right to lead the children. So some colonists celebrate, they got rid of the tax, but They say this. You have to watch the government because they're going to come back and do this again at some point. That's if they claim to still have the power, they're going to use it.
When did they have that governor in Virginia?
Governor of Virginia.
I thought he was the governor for the colonies.
Well, Virginia is its own colony. It's its own government. So it's like a state government today, right?
Oh, I thought it was. I guess I thought it was for all of them.
No.
Since I lived there, we did all the little, how they have their history reenactments there, and we did that on the weekends with our daughters. And
Well, just like today, each state has their own governor. Each colony had their own governor. Depending which colony it is, some of them are elected by the landowning white men of that colony.
They still have some of those buildings up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the way they looked back then. And
But some colonies, the governor is directly appointed by the king. Those are called the royal colonies.
I think that's what he.
Yeah. And Massachusetts is one of those. The governor of Massachusetts is personally appointed by the British king.
The first room when you walked in was just full of swords.
Yeah.
The Virginia governor.
Yeah. But I can't. I think Virginia might have been a royal colony. I can't remember. I'd have to look it up.
I think it was.
Yeah, I think the government took it over way early in its colonial history when it was on the verge of collapse. But again, I'd have to look that up. All right, but many colonists are celebrating the fact that the tax is gone. Many others are saying, well, wait a minute, don't celebrate so much, and we still have to be vigilant. We have to pay attention because they're going to maybe come back and do it later. And just a couple years later, the British government comes back and does it. Under a different prime minister, a different kind of Speaker of the House in Parliament, basically, this guy named Townshend, passes another series of laws that are generally called the Townshend Acts, named after him. He claims, and Parliament claims, that these are not tax laws, these are merely laws to regulate the trade market. But the colonists look at this series of laws and say, well, it's regulating it in a way where we're actually going to pay more in taxes. So yeah, it really is a tax, just by another name. So it's like the government's trying to sneak through another tax without really admitting it. So this built another conflict between the colonists. They ratchet up their complaint again. They meet again. They demand that this stuff is repealed, or they threaten boycotts. And a couple years later, by 1770, Parliament buckles. They give in again to this economic threat. So this is another crisis point from 67 to 70, early 70. So that's 3 years of worrying about violence, mob violence, attacks against the royal governors, against tax collectors, possibility of civil war. That is only averted when Parliament gives in, mostly because Townshend at that point died. And then the rest of the guys in Parliament said, it was all his fault. So they all blamed the dead guy. So they repeal almost all the taxes except this one tax on tea. And they keep that one as symbolic of their authority to pass taxes. So it's very similar to the kind of declaratory act where we're getting rid of all the taxes except for this one, just as a reminder that we still have the power to do this. Does that make sense? And you get a very similar result. A lot of colonists celebrate, say, all right, we stood up for our rights in a very kind of manly, upstanding way. We threatened our own government. We reminded the government that we have these natural-born rights. And eventually Parliament backed down again. Does that make sense? But for some colonists, this tea tax was still a reminder, and they wanted that to be taken out also. But for a few years, you can see by the amount of imports after 1770, you get a few years of general peace and quiet between the colonists and London, the British government. You can see every single time there is a crisis, like with the Stamp Act, imports go down. Because a lot of colonists are so pissed off, they start their own boycott, and they just want to buy colonial-made goods. When the tax is repealed, imports go back up. Until the next crisis, you get the Townshend Acts are kind of in between 1767 to 70, and you see them, imports just collapse again. And once it's solved in 1770, the law's repealed, imports explode. And they stay pretty good for the next few years, right? So there's a few years of general kind of feeling in the colonies that we've stood up for our rights. Parliament has finally, they've kind of agreed, and we've averted this crisis. But violent acts continue, and the most famous is called the Boston Massacre. This happens in 1770, really at the height of the Townshend crisis. Basically, the British government was sending more and more troops, especially to Boston, because Boston is like the center of all this rebellious, angry, mob violent sentiment.
Why? Why was it Boston if there were 13?
Mostly because it's one of the biggest merchant cities. But they develop a reputation of being the most extreme area of the colonies. And there's different historians that have all kinds of different ideas about why that is. Could be a Puritan background, could be a lot of Quakers moved in. Boston was almost entirely a merchant class. But different historians have different interpretations of why Boston. Does that make sense? Yeah. Question?
What was the Intolerable Act on the previous slide? Did we go over that?
The Intolerable Acts? Those are basically, we haven't gotten there yet. Yeah, that's going to be 1774, 75, somewhere around there. Yeah. Yeah. But these soldiers are in Boston in large numbers, and they're marching up and down the city streets on a daily basis. They're on patrol in the city to try to stop mobs from forming and riots breaking out and whatnot. And a lot of the people in Boston don't like these soldiers. They start calling them foreign occupiers, which gives you an idea of what they think about themselves and this British force. They start thinking about them as from a different country. And there's all kinds of stories about all the stuff that the people of Boston do to these soldiers out on patrol every day. Like if they're marching down the street and you're in a 2 or 3 story building and you're up in a window, you drop a bunch of cold water on them or something like that. Sometimes throw rocks at them from a distance, yell insulting things at them, right? So it's not a good place for the soldiers to be. They don't like it. And the rumor is that the worst thing that the people of Boston did to the soldiers is that the women of Boston turned their backs on the soldiers. Which, you get what I mean by that? They refused relations with the soldiers, put it that way. No? Okay. So that was like the most insulting thing that the soldiers could possibly like try to put up with. They just couldn't stand that.
That was drew the line.
Huh?
That drew the line.
Yep, and a lot of the soldiers are pretty angry at the people of Boston for this kind of stance against them. So there's a lot of kind of animosity on both sides of this equation. In early March, I think it's like March 5th or so, some soldiers are on patrol, and reportedly one of the people of the city, one of the colonists, basically yelled at these soldiers marching by that they're a bunch of women, which is probably not a smart thing to say to a bunch of soldiers with guns. So one soldier was so offended that he kind of turned around, went back and slapped the guy. And at that point, the colonist says, "Oh, you're abusing me. My rights are so destroyed. How dare you do this? I'm an innocent person." And the rest of the soldiers think this guy's ridiculous. So they try to march away, but a mob starts to gather. And the mob encircles these few soldiers out on patrol. And from that point, the story is kind of murky because a lot of different people give a lot of different accounts of what happened. The soldiers say that the mob gathers and pushes them up against a building to where their backs are literally against a wall. It's getting dark out, and the soldiers are getting afraid that this mob's going to kill them. They're outnumbered vastly. And the leader of this contingent, I think it's about 7 or 8 soldiers, as a threat to the crowd, the guy says basically the crowd should disperse, go home. And the crowd doesn't leave. And so the captain tells the soldiers to load their guns, put bullets in their guns, and prepare to fire, which is a threat against the people, right? We have loaded guns now, you should probably go home. And after that, some people in the crowd say that that captain gave the order to raise the guns and shoot. To shoot into the crowd to get them to leave. The captain disputed that because they do shoot into the crowd and kill, I think, 4 or 5 colonists outright. At their trial for murder, the captain and his soldiers say that they were backed up against the wall, they loaded their weapons, and then one of them get hit with a snowball or something, and his gun went off, and the rest of the soldiers thought that was an emergency, and so they all shot into the crowd. So the soldiers say it was all accidental. A lot of the colonists say that this is actually what the image you see on the left, which is murder. Does that make sense? So the 2 different images, the 2 different accounts you get of the so-called Boston Massacre are very different. And this is what a lot of the most rebellious colonists, led by some guys in Boston, they paid an artist to draw this. And they had it published in all the newspapers up and down all the colonies to spread anti-British feeling. So this is propaganda. Revolutionary propaganda. Does that make sense? So this is probably the one you see in all your textbooks from a very early age in the United States when you're reading about the Revolution. But these soldiers did go to trial. It was a trial by jury. Does anyone know what happened to them? Found innocent.
Was it someone famous as their lawyer?
Yeah, John Adams was their lawyer. And this is the first time that he comes into the revolutionary movement. He basically believed that every person accused of a crime deserves to have adequate legal defense. And so he volunteered to be their lawyer. And he was ostracized by many people in Boston. Right? He has a private legal practice. He's a lawyer. And he almost went bankrupt after that because so few people in Boston wanted him to be their lawyer. So few people hired him. So amongst the revolutionaries, he's a very kind of hated guy for a little while until he takes their side later on in the movement. Yeah.
Why did he do that?
Why?
Did he take, no, he took the Bostonian side.
No, he took the soldiers' side.
Why? Why?
Because he said that anyone accused of a crime deserves a good lawyer. And he was one of the best lawyers in the city. He said if you don't have a good lawyer, then it's not really a trial. Right? If you don't have a good lawyer, chances of being found not guilty plummet. That's no trial. That's not a pursuit of truth. That's just what we today call a kangaroo court, just a evidence one day and guilty the next day and hang him the third day, right? So yeah. But later on, Adams will join with the rebels when he says that the British government eventually will go too far in just throwing people in jail for not committing many crimes and whatnot. So, yeah, that's where Adams comes into the big historical record. Other questions? But, 5 people are killed in this, and it's portrayed as a massacre. So, every human life is special. But this is also, words can be propaganda, right?
Right.
There have been other protesters killed in much larger numbers around the world that even today in the United States we don't even talk about. We talk about it like a tragedy or something like this. It's not a massacre. So a lot of times it really depends on who's doing the shooting and who's doing the dying, right? So you can watch the news on almost a daily or at least a weekly basis and understand just how things are being portrayed. Right. Moving on from here. All right. So you have this Tea Act, a tax on tea that is still kind of in effect. It's being implemented. The Tea Act the tax on tea goes through a new phase. When the British East India Company, this giant international company that's running British trade in China and India and now a lot of other colonies, the company's been so badly managed for so many years that it's basically bankrupt. It's going under. And because so many members of Parliament are big investors in that company, they pass a law that is basically a company bailout law, which alters the tea tax law that lowers taxes on the company's tea in the British home islands itself, and says that any extra tea that the company cannot sell in Britain itself can be sent to the American colonies, and no other company is allowed to bring tea in. So it's setting up a monopoly in the Americas. And there's a lot of American tea makers that don't like this at all, because they realize that they're going to be destroyed economically by this law. So a lot of American merchants, businessmen, come to believe that if you allow monopoly in the tea market, that's just the government's first step. They're going to start building monopolies in all kinds of other markets and going to destroy your business too. If you make tables or sugar or whatever. That, again, this is just the first step in a government tyranny. And if you let the government get away with this, then it's going to keep growing and growing and growing and growing to the point where you'll eventually just be a slave to the government. Yeah.
So they made it cheap on themselves, but to Americans they made it more expensive?
Possibly more expensive.
That's the same thing that happened with the sugar.
Well, the sugar's a little different. They made sugar actually cheaper because they're lowering the tax on sugar. At this point, they're just increasing the supply. So if you keep the tax the same, but you massively increase how much tea is getting into the market, then the price will probably go down. But if the price goes down too far, American tea makers can't make enough profit to survive. They go bankrupt, and then you're left with one company. That's a monopoly tactic, right? And look at Walmart. What do they promise? What's the number one thing? Why do people go to Walmart?
Always low prices.
Because it's cheap. They say if you come in with a lower price from another company, you can prove it, we'll lower our price to meet theirs, and we'll sell whatever we've got to you for that price. That's specifically to get you to go to Walmart instead of anywhere else. It's price warfare. It's a monopolistic tactic. So yeah. So much of the hatred against the Tea Act is, number one, they see it as an obvious bailout for this failed company. And number two, it's a monopoly. Or has the very strong likelihood of becoming a monopoly, put it that way. So there's a lot of anger in the colonies about this law. And in Boston, they decided to do something pretty extraordinary about it. They dress up as a bunch of natives. Why natives? I will never figure out, probably. And they sneak into Boston Harbor in the middle of the night. Despite what this painting says. This looks like it happens in the middle of the day, but I guess it's hard to make a painting of the nighttime. But they dress up as a bunch of natives. They break onto the East India Company's boats, and they take the tea out of the holds and they throw it overboard into the sea.
Wait, who dressed up? I'm sorry.
A bunch of rebellious colonists.
Oh.
And they say this is in direct response to that Tea Act, to the law. And they destroy a massive amount of company tea, which is valued huge amounts of money. So the company doesn't like this at all. And they celebrate it as standing up for their rights. And they call it the Boston Tea Party. The company and the British government in London had a different interpretation of this. They didn't call it the Boston Tea Party. What do you think they called it? Yeah, they called it like the Boston Tea Destruction of Property Night or something like that. So it's not a party to them. So they passed this new law immediately when they hear about all this destruction. Another law comes out of London that they call the Coercive Act. And this is specifically designed to coerce the city of Boston to repay the company for all that lost property, all the destroyed tea. So it has three big things. Number one, it closes the harbor indefinitely until the city raises enough money to pay the company back for all of its lost profit. So it's a law designed to get money out of the city. Number two, because they realize that this is probably a conspiracy amongst many colonists, there's a restriction on public meetings. You can't gather in large numbers in and around Boston anymore. No public assemblies without the written permission from the governor. And number three, they say we're going to send a whole lot more soldiers to Boston to enforce it. And Boston basically declares itself a martyr to the cause of freedom for the colonies. Does that make sense? Leaders in Boston and from Massachusetts, kind of rebellious leaders, go to all the rest of the colonies and they write letters and say that they're doing this to us first. But unless all 13 of our colonies get together to try to reject this and do something about it, then they're going to come to your colony next. Does that make sense?
So that was the act that after the Intolerable Act, the complete imports stopped.
Yeah, well, this is what the colonists call it. They label it the Intolerable Acts. I mean, that's more propaganda, obviously, because it's tough to support something that's intolerable, right? But the British never call it that. And there's a lot of loyalists in the colonies, loyal to the British government, who think that these rebels, they've gone too far. That the law should be enforced. That these are criminals. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What were they so patient and they used it in?
What was their what?
Were they so patient? Britain. London.
Well, there's always debates in Parliament and the advisors to the king. Should we get really heavy-handed?
I mean, at this point they are.
Because once you have people complaining a lot, government's in a really tough position. And you can kind of put up with the complaints and not get too angry and not be too severe in punishing them. But what happens if you don't severely punish them? A lot of them might be encouraged, thinking, well, they're never going to come after me, so I'll just keep going and going, and it gets more and more extreme, violent activities, right? The other side of that coin is, if you go in and start punishing people severely, that might push more people to their side, right? The ones on the fence, the indecisive ones, who haven't taken a stand either way. That might be more evidence to convince them that, yes, this government's turning into a tyranny. So it's very problematic. Either way the government goes, there's a big risk. Right? Does that make sense? And it's easy to say in hindsight, like looking back from today, maybe they should have been more severe at first and thrown people in jail and harshly punished people. But we know how all this turned out. And it didn't really turn out very well for the British. So the path that they followed, historically, seems to have failed. So it's easy for us to say, well, they should have done something different. But at the time, it's hard to know what to do. Right? So, yeah. Other questions? Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions about this stuff? But this is coming to the end of the back and forth because the colonists, the leaders of each colony, get together and they create what they call a First Continental Congress, which is basically another meeting like the Stat Bat Congress. It's the third time they've done this kind of thing. I think this one meets in Philadelphia. But they meet and they demand the repeal of the Coercive Acts. They say, you better repeal this by January 1st of the next year or else. And their or else is pretty simple. They threaten more boycotts because it's worked twice so far. And they set a deadline. If Parliament has not repealed the Coercive Acts by January 1st, was it 1775, then all the colonies will start a boycott of British-made goods. And this time the leaders of Parliament put their foot down and say, all right, we've had it. Let's see what your boycott can do. So the Parliament does not give in. Deadline passes and the boycott starts. And it destroys British trade in their colonies. The economies plummet. It just annihilates them. And Parliament still is not giving in. The king is not listening to their demands. At least that's what the leaders of this Congress say. So at that point, the Congress authorizes the creation of a militia army because they think they're about to be invaded. That's their term. Invaded by their own home country, which is an interesting word to choose because invasion implies foreigners invading. So they authorize the creation of what will eventually be called the Continental Army, and they placed George Washington as its leader. Mostly because Washington was the only guy at the Congress who had any military experience at all. He had been a colonel in the British Army. And parts of those militias in Massachusetts, just outside Boston, will have a couple of run-ins with the official British Army in the area, and they will start shooting at each other. So that's the first so-called battles at Lexington and Concord. So this has been, again, 12 years of back and forth, demands, giving in, counter demands. It's run the gamut. And this is where they start really fighting on the battlefield. Does that make sense? Moving on. Questions? I don't know. Good? Alrighty. Okay, so that's a real quick map. Here's Boston over here, way on the right, where these kind of red arrows end. And Lexington and Concord are kind of towns on the way to the armory. So the British went marching out of Boston one day to go to the army and get all those guns before the rebels can get them. And on the way, they ran into a couple of colonist militias in these towns, Lexington and Concord. And people were killed on both sides. And then they went marching back to Boston later that day. And that starts the official war, as it would eventually be called. So you don't have to write down all these, but these are the three kind of major phases of all the conflict that we've been talking about. At first, just harming the businessmen, and then after the Stamp Act, or the Sugar Act especially, the businessmen get this ability to outrage the whole population in the colonies, or as many as they can convince. And then the last phase is kind of just mutual fear and hatred of each other, really circling each other, eventually preparing for war. All right, you don't have to write all this one down either. When the fighting breaks out, the war goes on for a year. The immediate question is, should these colonies break away and declare themselves to be an independent country, or series of countries. The guys at the Continental Congress are very resistant to that for a long time, basically hoping that the conflict doesn't go on for very long. But it got increasingly bloody through the rest of 75 and going into 76. The guys from Boston, mostly like John Adams, are always trying to push the rest of the colonies to declare independence. So the guys from Boston are the real radicals, mostly. By June of 76, the guys from Boston convinced the rest of the Congress to at least be allowed to write up a document declaring independence so that they can at least discuss what independence would mean, how they would go about it, how they would try to achieve it, what the process would be. So the guys from Boston are allowed to make a little subcommittee to draft a document declaring independence. And eventually, all the work got kind of shunted off to a young guy named Jefferson from Virginia, and these are eventually approved. Well, you don't have to write all this down. We'll just go through the Declaration piece by piece to try to break it up into its major ideas so we know exactly what they said they were talking about when they issue this to the world. First paragraph is really Jefferson saying that throughout human history, sometimes you get revolutions. And when a revolution hits, when you have one group of people that want to break away from their former country and declare themselves a new country, he says that this happens every once in a while. The first sentence, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, declare independence, which have connected them with another people. And he says that just if you look back in human history, this happens every once in a while. And he says that the laws of nature and of nature's God understand that this happens. It's just something that occurs. It's natural sometimes. Does that make sense? And that the next section is that God wants the new country, the newly independent country, to be equal with the old country. That they should be a separate and equal station. That means if these colonies break away and become a new country, that they're not like a second-rate country or anything like that. That they should be viewed as a fully fledged equal country with Britain. That's what God and nature want. Does that make sense?
But not for the slaves.
Huh?
But not for the slaves.
Yeah, he's not talking about slaves. He's pretty racist. As a lot of the rebel leaders were, they're starting to come to the decision, at least, that they just don't consider slaves to be full-fledged people.
Right.
Yeah. And at the end of this paragraph, he basically says that if you're going to declare independence and you want to be an equal new country, that you have to tell the world why. You have to declare the causes which impel you to separation. So why are you doing this? You have to issue this statement to the world. You can't just do it. You have to have good reasons. And this implies that at the end of this paragraph, that the next section is going to, start giving the reasons. Does that make sense? All right. Next paragraph. Again, you don't have to write all this down. These are the really famous words. We, the people signing this document, the revolutionaries, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So he's basically saying that God creates people, or the Creator, the universe, whatever you want to define that as, and that the creative forces automatically give you unalienable rights. All right. What does unalienable mean? What does alienable mean?
Like isolated?
Yeah, isolated, separated. So what does unalienable mean? Yeah, they're together and can never be separated. They're unalienable. They're with you always. You always have these rights. Does that make sense? All right, what does self-evident mean? What does it mean for something to be self-evident? Obvious. Yeah. I don't have to think about something. I look at table here. It is self-evidently a table. Right? Doesn't take a lot of analysis. It's there. That's what it is. So he says these truths are self-evident, that they are naturally a part of you as a person. And these truths he's talking about are these rights that cannot be separated. So he doesn't want to list all of the rights. He says just among these. So these are like the three most important. And he basically takes this right from John Locke. You have the right to life. The government cannot kill you whenever they feel like it. Right? You have the right to liberty. The government cannot throw you in jail to take your liberty whenever they feel like it. They have to convict you of a crime. And he doesn't want to use the word property apparently, so he calls it pursuit of happiness. And he says that you have these rights as a fundamental part of being a human person. Right? He says all men, but I would hope that today we include women. But he says all men are created equal, and they have given these rights given to them by the Creator. And you can never give these rights away. You can never sell them. They can never be taken from you. They are inalienable. They are with you always. Does that make sense? All right. So questions about that at all? That's really the key to all this. No? Good? All right. So again, he says the three kind of important ones he highlights are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But that's not the only ones. He says just among all these rights, these are the three I'm talking about. So he leaves that door pretty open to add more later on, or according to your own personal interpretation. And the rest of the paragraph really follows John Locke's system. Jefferson really liked John Locke. He said, just like John Locke, that people come together at some point to create a government, mostly because they want to protect their rights. Having no government is dangerous because anyone can come and attack you and kill you without any fear of being punished. So he says, governments are created specifically to protect your natural, unalienable rights. That's government's function. That's its purpose. So he says, to secure all these rights, governments are created among men, getting their powers from the consent of the governed. The power of government comes from the people. And, next one, every once in a while, a government becomes destructive of these rights. Governments get powerful. Sometimes they get so powerful that they're doing the exact opposite of what they should. They're supposed to protect your rights. Some governments get so bad that they start harming your rights. Does that make sense? And he says when they do that, they are destructive of their own purpose. And at that point, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And that's his message about what's going on in these colonies. We have these governments to protect our rights, and the British government is going in and stealing our rights and throwing us in jail and doing all these horrible things to us. They're breaking the contract. They're becoming destructive of their own purpose. Does that make sense? Questions about that? No? This is clear to you. I'm seeing some confused looks. No? I don't know. You're good?
Yeah, we good.
Okay. And he says, obviously, if you rise up and destroy one government, a fairly sensible people will really just replace it with something new. Institute new government, laying its foundations on new principles, organizing the new powers in such a good form that are most likely to rebuild their safety and happiness. Basically, protect their rights again. If one government gets out of hand, you get rid of that one, replace it with something better. All right? So he's following a pretty logical system. You have rights. Government's supposed to protect your rights. If they don't, you should get rid of it. If you get rid of it, you should build something new. Right? All right. Moving on from there. He says that a prudent people, says people are prudent. People are careful. Revolution's a dangerous thing. It says that a careful people don't go to full-fledged revolution except for big, big reasons. Like, if you get a speeding ticket, is that going to convince you to rise up against the U.S. government? No. That's what he called a light and transient cause. That's a slap on the wrist. That's a small little thing. Because it's not worth the risk to you as a person to take up guns against your government, because you might get killed. You going to do that over a speeding ticket? Probably not. What will you do it over? If you see the army coming out and shooting the people. If you see your family members getting thrown in jail for no reason. Those are big, big worrying things. And at that point, if government's doing that, you can feel so threatened that why not take a risk? I might die in this revolution, but the government might come kill me anyway one day, so why not? Does that make sense? So he says careful people will only go to revolution for like really big systematic problems. And let's see, next one is when they go to revolution, it's usually through what he calls a long train of abuses and usurpations. Usurpation is like stealing power. And he says that the British government is basically pursuing invariably the same object, a design to reduce the people under an absolute despotism, an absolute dictatorship. And he says at that point when the people realize it's going on, it is their right and it is their duty to overthrow that bad government. You don't just have the right to revolution, you have a responsibility to revolution. And not just a responsibility to yourself, but to everyone else, to your community. Because everyone's threatened. You have a responsibility to your neighbors to rise up, and even if you get killed in the revolution, you did something for other people, right? So he says it's your social responsibility to rise up when you have a bad government that's trying to oppress the people. And he says that literally in the document, the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, stealing power, all having the direct object to establish an absolute tyranny over these states. So that's pretty hard language. That's getting personal. This living king is doing this. If you look at the whole history of the past 12 or 13 years, this is their whole project. This is all they've been doing to us for over a decade. Over and over and over and over again. And this has convinced the people to rise up and declare independence in a revolution. And the last part of the paragraph is, I'll just give you the proof. I'm going to list every little thing that the British have done to these colonies over the past 13 or so years. And let the world make its own decision. Are we justified in doing this or not? And if you ever look at the Declaration, the next few pages is just a laundry list of every little thing, a lot of which we've already talked about tonight. Right? All the little taxes and massacres and putting people in jail and whatnot. So he gives a full list. And this is the draft that is eventually approved and signed. But they altered it. He gave a rough draft to the Congress first, and they read it as a full Congress, and they altered some of the language. One of the things they changed was his very last accusation in that list. The very worst thing, because just like in every movie or whatnot, you see a little bunch of conflicts at first and like a big one at the end, right? A big fight at the end. He left the most horrible accusation against the British government for last. And what do you think that accusation was? What's the worst thing that the British king can do to these colonies?
Enslave them.
Well, very close. The king brought slavery. The monarchy created slavery and allows slavery in the colonies. That's the biggest, he says, that's basically a crime against humanity.
Also, was he against that?
He hated slavery. That's one of the great hypocrisies of Jefferson. He hated slavery. He tried to get rid of it in the Declaration. He'll become governor of Virginia. He'll write the Virginia kind of constitution. He'll try to get rid of slavery over and over again. But he owned slaves.
Yeah, I was about to ask. Doesn't he own slaves?
Yep. Well, Jefferson is a walking contradiction in an almost infinite amount of ways. He tells people to avoid debt. He is constantly in debt. He tells people to all be good farmers on their little plots of land, but he owns a giant plantation and spends a lot of his time in cities. He's a walking contradiction. So historians always have a problem trying to interpret Jefferson. He's one of these guys who says one thing but just consistently does something else. And often the exact opposite of what he advised people to do.
So it's like a parent.
So he's what?
I said that's like a parent. That was my parent.
Yeah. But historians always, Jefferson is one of these giant mysteries in all of U.S. history. Like, how can you hold it in your mind to hate slavery while you own slaves? How can you keep your sanity while doing both? Right? They're just so much in opposition. So yeah, Jefferson is a giant problem to interpret, and it still drives historians nuts right down to this day. They're still arguing about everything related to Jefferson. What do you really mean? Because he writes all this stuff about liberty and freedom, but he's not really doing it.
Because of Sally Hemings?
Oh, this is before she's around.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Jefferson is not famous by this point. He gets famous as the writer of this thing. He becomes a household name in the colonies as the writer of this thing. Before this comes out, he had published some speeches and he was a representative in Virginia, but he wasn't very well known yet. But he becomes world famous and still is today, mostly off of these statements. Right? This thing is not just read in the United States. This is read all over the world. And it's still inspiring revolutions today.
You can buy the little... We had them at my house in Texas. I just left
Oh, yeah.
them with the little... In Virginia, they sell
Yep.
all that, you know.
Oh, you can get them for free if you want. I got a copy right here in my bag for free.
Really?
Yeah, just give them away.
Where do you get them at? What is it?
I got them on, I think it was here at Chafee we did a Constitution Day celebration, so we each got a book of like all the big government documents.
They have the ASCC building in Rancho.
Well, no, this one looks like the old paper and it's rolled up and you...
Oh, I don't have that. I have it in actual book form. But the Constitution, declarations in here, a bunch of the big speeches in U.S. history, blah, blah, blah. So, I always have it with me. Huh?
Have you traveled?
No, I don't have money to travel.
I love Virginia. There's so much there.
I don't like humidity, so I probably wouldn't like Virginia much. But no, I'd like to. I just, some places don't pay us what we're worth.
Yeah.
Put it that way.
That's another city I lived in
Yep.
too, so I kind of...
So, all my friends keep telling me, I should go visit these places and see all this stuff.
You would
I'm
love
like,
it. Even
it'd be great.
Mine, when they were little, I would take them just to get out of the house. And
yep. Yeah. And what do we got here in LA? Well, we got a lot of stuff to do in LA, but most people want to go to Disneyland or some damn thing.
well, we do have the little, but it's not close to us. Those missions. And,
Oh yeah. Well, there's one. The closest one is in San Gabriel. There's another one in San Fernando, though. San Juan Capistrano, that has one. Yeah. But why would you want to go look at like historically significant stuff when you can go like have King Kong shake your train? Right?
I do like shopping and all, but everything gets old.
Yeah.
The crowd and traffic and
Yeah.
looking for parking. And just, yeah, like that's the typical girl thing and California thing to do. But it gets old, you know, and you get broke. I
So
mean,
That's why I stay home.
Teach my kids something else.
Books are cheap.
That's true.
Endless entertainment. Instead of watching a DVD that you pay $20 to watch an hour and a half of, you can buy a nice big book for about the same amount of money and take you 12 or 15 hours to read it. You could use your imagination too. It's so much more fun. But such is life.
That's true. If you like it.
Alrighty. But in the Declaration, when they went to kind of edit the document before signing it, they took that one on slavery out. Because a lot of the southern colonies had a lot of slaves, and they say if there's this statement hating on slavery, then the southern colonies won't support this, and you'll split your movement.
And that kind of went all
Yeah.
the way up to D.C.
And he wanted
Yep.
it like universal, right?
Well, they want as many colonies in the movement as they could, because any movement wants as many members as it can get, because that's how you get strength. Yep. Absolutely. All right. So the war is on. The Declaration is signed on July 4th, and that's why we have 4th of July, Independence Day. Sound familiar? That's what we're celebrating. So my advice is always, the document is actually really small. It's really only about 2 paragraphs. You can read it in about 5 minutes. So I always tell people, on this day that you're given off as a national holiday, take 5 minutes out of your day before going to your barbecues or whatever you're doing, and read the thing and think about it, because that's the whole point in having the holiday, is to think about what these ideas mean. That's my favorite holiday too.
Is it really?
Oh yeah, Revolution. Absolutely.
You ever do that?
Overthrow the tyranny.
Do you ever-
But maybe I'm too into politics. So I've been accused of that before. But the war is on, and the fighting is ongoing. The Declaration doesn't change that. It's not like the British give up. Oh, you declared independence? Okay, you can have your own country. We'll go home. No way. They fight to keep control. And the British basically figure that if they just start conquering the major cities, then we'll win the war that way. And they do conquer all the major cities. The first one they took was Boston. There we go. Up here at the kind of northern reaches of the populated areas. They conquered Boston outright right at the outset of the war, and they occupied it for a year. Boston was under British occupation. Did not stop the revolution. So the British figured, we've got control of Boston, and that hasn't stopped the fighting, so let's take a bunch of our troops out of Boston, let's invade New York City. They conquered New York City outright. Push Washington and his army, not just out of the city, but out of the state. And push them into, I think it's even beyond Jersey. And push them into Pennsylvania or something. So that's humiliating. The British now have outright complete control, occupying New York City. The revolution continues. So after that, they invade Philadelphia. Conquer Philadelphia. Doesn't work. They're trying to come up with really any strategy they can by this point to break the back of the revolution. But it just keeps going and going. They eventually, Washington's his battle plan is to avoid a gigantic battle. He has a smaller army. It is badly trained. It's mostly a bunch of volunteer farmers who maybe shot a shotgun at a turkey or something at some point in their life, and that was really about it. These people are farmers. They have no experience in the army, or the overwhelming majority of them.
It's like
They're volunteer militia.
the National Guard as well.
Yeah, except the National Guard, they train in how to use those weapons, right?
Yeah. Basic training.
Yeah. But they are a very weak army. And Washington knows if he gets into a real giant battle against the British army, he's going to lose. His army will be destroyed. He'll probably be captured and executed. So he fights what we call war of avoidance, just trying to survive, hoping that eventually the British will get tired of fighting and they'll give up. And it's a, over time, pretty successful strategy. Eventually, France joins in this war.
Isn't that called guerrilla warfare?
That's a part of it. Guerrilla warfare is more like hit-and-run type tactics. You hide in the forest. When you see the enemy is in a weak position, you hit them real hard and then run away. You don't go toe-to-toe against them, right?
Vietnam, right?
Oh yeah, that's what that's what the Vietnamese did against the U.S. forces, because same kind of power relation. U.S. came with overwhelming firepower, and so the insurgents, the revolutionaries, hid in the forest, hit weak targets, what we today call soft targets. But they didn't have the term guerrilla warfare back then. It's a more modern term, more recent term. But after a while, I think in was it 79, somewhere around there, France joins the war. Why does France want to join this? Got nothing to do with France.
Because the French hate the English.
Colonies there.
Yeah, the French hate the British. They're in a worldwide conflict for dominance, and these colonies are a cash cow for the British. Make a whole lot of money for the British. So the French figure, let's join the colonists, the revolutionaries in this, help them gain their independence, and then Britain will lose this revenue. Hurts the British economy, hurts Britain around the world, and helps France. Does that make sense? So the French don't really care about the Americans all that much. They're just useful. That's what we call today geopolitics. And eventually, the last big battle is a place called Yorktown, which is down here in Virginia, where basically a British army got cornered. They went into the fort. They retreated into the fort, which is surrounded on three sides by water. It's a peninsula. And once they went into the fort, Washington and a French army under this general named Lafayette closed in to trap him in the fort. And then the French Navy came up behind in the water and just launched cannon fire on the fort until the British surrendered. And when the British surrender, they lose a whole army. Like they're all prisoners of war, so they're not fighting anymore. And that's really the last big British army going around the area. And that's the loss in, I think it's about October of 81, that convinces the British government to give up. So there's really a ceasefire after this, and they start negotiating peace. And the negotiations are pretty tough. They're ongoing. Spain has joined the war on the colonist side, again, mostly to hurt Britain. So the negotiations drag on for almost 2 years. Mostly because France and Spain wanted to keep fighting because they're doing damage to the British Empire. The British are in a weakened position and they just want to keep hitting them. The colonists, now calling themselves the Americans, they don't want to fight anymore. They say, well, the British are going to give us our country, so that accomplishes our goal. But getting the French and the Spanish to sign off on it was really this kind of sticking point. And what land is going to change hands and whatnot. But this is the official painting of the peace negotiations, where Benjamin Franklin was the lead negotiator. And this one's John Adams and John Jay. But the British were so humiliated by losing this war that they refused to sit for the portrait. So they're just never drawn into it. They're never painted. And this is the finished product. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So this would be like if the United States government lost a war against Guam and now Guam is independent. That would be pretty humiliating for the U.S. leaders. And that's their action to avoid kind of having their person represented as the losers in this war. Does that make sense? So officially from 1783, that's when the United States becomes an independent country. It is mostly a collection of basically 13 different countries, 13 different states. They each print their own money, they each have their own tax laws. They're basically 13 different societies. And that creates the economic catastrophe of the 80s. Now that they're separated from Britain, they're separated from all the British colonies in the world, which means a lot of their customers throughout the world are now opposed to buying American-made products. So that hurts the American economy, the export economy. And sometimes Parliament passes laws for the rest of their colonies to not do business with the United States, or any of the states, or any company from those states. And if you're going to do business with them, they jack up the tax rate. Does that make sense? Another is that a whole bunch of British companies want to destroy the American economy, strangle it at birth, basically. So they start sending all their extra products into the American markets, trying to drive down prices through price warfare and destroy American businesses. So this is economic hardball, often led by the British government itself in London. Most of the American ships that had been sailing all around the world, buying and selling, they were sunk during the war, or at least badly damaged. So American companies have to rebuild their boats. A lot of these states also go into debt. They borrow money very heavily to pay their soldiers to try to win the war. So right off the bat, they have huge debt problems, and they have a collapsing economy. So they have a major economic crisis. Question?
To who do they borrow money from? Who they
Anybody. Anybody. Just like the U.S. government does today. They don't care where you're from. They don't care how much money you have. As long as you've got some money and you're willing to lend it to them, they'll take it. No. It's a worldwide market. Today they mostly do it through computers, computer accounting. But back then they print up pieces of paper and say a $20 bond for the government of Massachusetts. And probably their biggest problem is that, again, these are 13 different countries, basically. And in their desperation to get economic growth restarted, say in New York, they lower their tariff, which is a tax on imports. So if most of the colonies have a tax rate for importing something into the colony, or the state, sorry, if their normal tax rate is like 12% amongst most of the states, New York lowers theirs to 10%. So that companies that want to sell stuff in these United States will now all flood into New York, right? Because the tax rate is lower. And so New York hopes that more goods will move through their port. That means there will be more jobs, more businesses, more activity, right? Does that make sense? But there's 12 other colonies. And they all learned that lesson. Once all the stuff starts going through New York, this is just an example, what does New Jersey do? They lower their rate to 9%. Suddenly all those British businesses start going through New Jersey. What does Rhode Island do? Do the same thing. And each state got into price warfare against each other. So eventually the tax rate had been whittled down to like 1%, just tiny amount. That means that governments aren't making enough revenue to pay their bills. They're in economic freefall. Mostly because they're competing against each other. Does that make sense? All right. And that leads directly, well, there's a collapse of trade kind of a chart. So that's a kind of diagram to show you how bad it was getting. I mean, imports are plummeting. Exports are barely rising, if at all. So this is a depressed economy in virtually all the states. And in a lot of ways it seems like a conspiracy amongst the British to kill the American economy, drown it at birth, so that they can take over again at some point in the future. And a lot of Americans often started to say, well, maybe our lives were better when we were British colonists. Maybe we should reattach ourselves to Britain somehow. But this leads to the eventual Constitution. The goal of the Constitution is largely to literally unite these 13 different states together under one national government. It's what we call a federal government. It's a federated government. So each state retains some of its own abilities to pass certain laws and whatnot. But the Constitution will force all states to have kind of the same laws in certain areas. The biggest ones are over trade and debt. the Constitution says that all states have to have the same tariff laws, the same import tax rates. It also says that the old state debts will have to be paid off somehow. They're going to start trying to figure out how to do that pretty quickly. So a lot of this is really economically driven, the creation of the Constitution. The Constitution is written up by unelected people from each state and then published, and voters throughout the states ratify it, one state after another, in '88, for the most part. Some states would take a little longer. But it does a lot of things. One of the most horrible things it does, without any doubt, is that southern states, they came back and said, you have to keep slavery or else we won't participate. So it makes the importation of new slaves legal for another 20 years. The original Constitution said 20 years after the Constitution is adopted, you can import as many slaves as you want. But after 20 years, it is possible for the U.S. government to make a law stopping the importation of new slaves. Does not get rid of slavery, just gets rid of bringing new slaves into the country. And they also declare slaves to be 3/5 of a person when counting state populations. So they're not even an official person. So a constitution and many states that talk about freedom and liberty and equality and the rights of men and all these kinds of things, in its own document sells out millions of people. In pursuit of a unity that really won't be very effectual. I mean, they're going to fight a civil war over slavery less than 100 years later. Yep.
Wasn't the 3/5 of a person mean more of against the South, so they will have more governmental representation?
Yep. There's very little slavery in most of the northern states. And those northern states will start at their state laws, state level, eliminating slavery, making it illegal, right after early 1800s, 18 teens, 1820s. But they're still very racist. They basically say slavery is inhuman, but white people are still better than darker people, and they come with all kinds of wacky laws and weird crap to stop racial intermarriage, and even sitting in the same restaurant. I mean, it gets pretty insane.
That's weird that, like, would they pay them, like, with food or, like...
What do you mean?
I didn't do that.
Like slaves?
Well, slaves aren't paid, but non-white people living in the north, they can get jobs and make money. So yeah. But a lot of northern white racists, if they believe that darker skinned people are like intellectually inferior, they can't understand complex ideas, then you don't really make that person an accountant, right? If you're a racist. Because accounting is a really important complex thing, right? Does that make sense? So a lot of the racists would say that, yes, they are human, they're technically equal, but we'll keep them in simpler, more kind of menial labor jobs. Yeah. Which is still a problem in the United States today if you look around at major institutions. I mean, Chaffey College issued a report like last week about the ethnicities of our faculty. And we're a Hispanic majority student population, right? With a 75% white majority faculty. So that's a problem. Or at least many people here at Chaffey think it's a problem, and some people don't seem to really care that much. But yeah, that report came out to the Faculty Senate last week. So institutional racism is still a problem and comes from a lot of this. Another problem with the Constitution is it's not fully democratic. It's a restricted democracy. Only white adult male landowners get to vote. So you have to own property. You have to own a house or a farm. If you're just living in someone else's house, even if you're an adult white male, you don't get a vote. So it's a restricted democracy. And even if you got a vote, you did not get to vote for a president of the United States or your U.S. senator. You only got to vote for your local member in the House of Representatives in the federal government. That was it. So heavily restricted democracy. And the history of the U.S. is largely ever since expanding the right to vote and how many more offices people actually get to vote for. So that's one way to look at U.S. history. And these are two of the guys that were heavily involved in drafting, writing the Constitution, especially Madison writing, and then through newspaper articles and public speeches and whatnot, trying to convince voters in the states to accept the Constitution. So they became known as writing the Federalist Papers. Those are the series of newspaper articles. And they're still heavily studied today for their arguments in defense of the Constitution. This is why it's good, this is why you should like it, and this is why you should vote for it. So the Constitution is ratified in 1788. First national elections are held in November 1788. Washington is chosen president. And the new government goes into effect basically December 1788. Goes and really starts operating starting in January. That's why we have elections in even-numbered years. Questions about that? Good. All right. Yep, that's the last one. So we'll stop there. So make sure you put your questions in the folder.